I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics. MessianicApologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for August the 19th, 2025. Presently, what is dominating the headlines is, of course, ending the war between Russia and Ukraine. And so later in our live stream, we will be discussing a number of the developments with that. But before we get into some of the news, we do have an important theology roundup. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about abortion. We talked about abortion ethics. This came from a comment we received last week. Somebody claiming that God was pro-choice because a fetus is not a human being until it takes its first physical breath. And so, by necessity, we reviewed some of the points involving abortion, how conservatives, how liberals in theology may approach it. Today, we continue with that theme, discussing the issue of the breath of life which human beings possess. Is the breath of life something solely physical, or could it actually be something metaphysical? This is a very important subject as it concerns matters of human uniqueness, being created in the image of God, and human personhood, something which everyone agrees those of the animal kingdom do not have. All right, so before we get started, I would like to reference our ministry publication, Messianics and the Afterlife. This is where our teaching today has been taken from, because matters of human uniqueness, human distinction, in contrast to the animals, definitely play into what happens between death and resurrection. Do human beings just go into complete unconsciousness, or does the human consciousness get transported to another dimension until the future resurrection? That's a big debate in theology today, and within the Messianic sphere of influence, you see a wide array of opinions. So Messianics and the Afterlife, available in both paperback and ebook, thoroughly discusses the issues of the intermediate state between death and resurrection and the different dimensions of eternal punishment. It also offers some Q&A on the afterlife and a preliminary analysis of where much of the subject matter currently stands for our faith community in the 2020s. Okay. Now, I need to switch screens really quickly so we can get into our material. Okay, there we go. And the question is raised: are human beings just animated chemicals? So to connect that to what we discussed yesterday, among many progressive Jews and Christians, a fetus is not a human being until it takes its first physical breath. So, until then, a fetus is what? Just a lump of chemicals, basically. So the question is, if the breath of life humans are granted by God, given by God, is just a physical breath, until that point, are human beings just animated chemicals? There is perhaps no bigger debate surrounding the intermediate state than what composes a human being. So, afterlife debates, what happens between death and resurrection, directly connected to questions of human personhood. Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians 5:23, "May the God of peace himself sanctify you entirely, and may your spirit and soul and body be preserved complete, without blame at the coming of our Lord Yeshua the Messiah. New American Standard. The sanctification of a human being, as portrayed in the scriptures, is one where a whole person, not just a physical body and neither just an immaterial consciousness, is to be changed by God. Theological proponents of either psychopanicky, more frequently or commonly known as soul sleep, or of an intermediate afterlife prior to resurrection should recognize this fact. The debate, rather, is focused around whether the various components of a human being can be separated at all, existing in multiple dimensions, or whether the various components of a human being can only exist in this dimension. Psychopanicists argue for a position of monism regarding the human person. They advocate that the human being, made up of body, soul, and spirit, can only exist in this present dimension of planet Earth. Advocates of an intermediate post-mortem afterlife prior to resurrection, by the very nature of holding to such a view, have to advocate some kind of dualism for the human being. Human beings are made up of a material substance from this dimension, as well as some kind of an immaterial substance from another dimension, with one substance which can be separated and exist independent of the body in some form, even if intended just for a limited duration of time. The majority position throughout the Orthodox, that's small o Orthodox, Jewish, and Christian theological traditions, is sometimes labeled as holistic dualism. Another description sometimes used is that humans are ensouled bodies. A human being should be perceived as being a single entity, a person who will be fully reconstituted and restored at the time of resurrection. But separate parts of a human being can exist independent or separate from the body, the essential soul, if you like, even though in being separated from the body, such a component part would be different and the person would be incomplete. John W. Cooper explains this kind of holism in his book, Body, Soul, and Life Everlasting. Quote, "It views an entity as a single primary functional system, not as a compound system constructed by linking two or more primary functional systems. It implies that parts do not operate independently within the whole, and that they would not necessarily continue to have all the same properties and functions if the whole were broken up. But holism does not necessarily imply that if the whole is broken up, all parts disintegrate into chaos and nothingness. Secondary systems might continue to exist, although without all the properties and capacities they had when integrated within the whole. On this view, souls, spirits, minds, or persons might be able to exist without organisms, although they would be deprived by the loss." Unquote. Cooper suggests that this kind of existence, albeit temporary, could be likened to how, given the right conditions, organs can sometimes survive outside of a body, such as those to be medically transplanted. Likewise, in today's computer age, and with what can be done with transferring software and files between an individual personal computer, mainframes, servers across the internet, and now even to our smartphones, the extra body survival of a human consciousness allowed by an eternal God in a different dimension with different rules of existence should not be that difficult to perceive. Okay, now this is where we get into the discussion of the breath of life. Both monists and holistic dualists appeal to the creation of Adam in Genesis to make their case, after announcing his intention to create humanity in his image. Genesis 1, 26 and 27, God created Adam. Genesis 2:7 says, "The Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." New American Standard. Both monists and holistic dualists agree that one part of the human being, the body, is clearly of this earth. They diverge on what it means for the human being to possess the breath of life, which makes a person a living being. The Hebrew of Genesis 2:7 says, "V'yipak be'apav nishmat chayim ve'yehi ha'adam lenefesh chaya," or God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. King James Version. To psychopanicists, the issue is closed. A human being is the combination of a physical body and a physical breath, which results in a soul. A human being, a soul, is thus entirely of this dimension of planet Earth. To their credit, psychopanicists have helped in wanting to get others to see how a human being does not have a soul, but rather is a soul, a nephesh. Thus, when the scriptures commonly speak in terms of that day there were added about 3,000 souls, psukai, Acts 2:41, New American Standard, it was not 3,000 immaterial consciousnesses which were saved, but 3,000 people. When a soul is talked about, it is frequently in reference to what a person is. Yet, there are still questions which need to be asked regarding what components make up this soul. Is it significant that in the creation of the animals, it is nowhere said that the animals had nishmat chayim, the breath of life, implanted into them? Both Jewish and Christian commentators have frequently thought this is significant. The Keil and Delitzsch commentary on the old quote, "The vital principle in man is different from that in the animal. The beasts only arose at the creative word of God," unquote. Nahum and Sarna's view in his Genesis commentary is, quote, "The uniqueness of the Hebrew phrase nishmat chayim matches the singular nature of the human body, which, unlike the creatures of the animal world, is directly inspirited by God himself." Victor P. Hamilton similarly indicates in his Genesis commentary, quote, "Unlike ruach, which is applied to God, man, animals, and even false gods, neshama is applied only to Yahweh and man. Thus, 2:7 may employ the less popular word for breath because it is man and man alone who is the recipient of the divine breath," unquote. The Orthodox Jewish Art Scroll Chumash commentary considers the Nishmat Chayim to be, quote, "the life that is unique to man, resulting in a person being a rational soul that includes the power of intelligent speech. This is what elevates a human above animal life," unquote. And we're going to close with this. It is not at all a stretch to conclude that the Nishmat Chayim breathed into the human being indicates how human people possess a uniqueness specifically endowed by their creator, a part originating from outside this earth. The Hebrew language has no specific word for mind or consciousness, but it is safe to say that this neshama, or specific breath from God, would constitute it or give rise to it. The combination of a physical body made of this dimension with a special breath made of another dimension produces the soul or the human being. When this combination is brought together, an essential human person is formed. Now, one of the things which ethically has got to be noted is if you believe that the Nishmat Chayim, which animals do not possess, is solely some kind of a physical breath, then what are you to do with the argument that until a fetus takes its first physical breath, it's just a lump of chemicals, basically, and it can be aborted at any time? That is the argument which is gaining ground among certainly progressive Jews and Christians, and a lot of people don't know what to do with it. The clear advantage of looking at Nishmat Chaim as being something metaphysical, which was given to Adam at his creation, because Hebrew lacks the term for mind or consciousness. Nishmat Chaim being about as close as limited Hebrew could get to that. The advantage of looking at Nishmat Chaim as something which all humans possess, as something metaphysical, can be used to discount this idea that, well, until a fetus takes its first physical breath, it's just a lump of chemicals. No, a human being's life begins on and around the point of conception. Nishmat Chaim is biblical Hebrew's way of saying the human was given a consciousness, some kind of a mind. And yes, I would say that an unborn child already possesses the Nishmat Chaim, i.e., the breath of life. So this is a loaded ethical subject. We're going to keep hearing about it more and more. I'm not quite sure how accurate some of the studies or surveys have been, but there are, let's just say, vast numbers of aborted children from Generation Z. And a lot of it, of course, involves how young people are sleeping around. They're not being responsible with contraception. They're not being raised going to church or being around God, the Bible, etc. So those are contributing factors, but it does not help when progressive theologians, liberals, claim that, well, the breath of life is solely something physical, and it's not, a fetus is not a person until it takes its first breath. But if the Nishmat Chaim was biblical Hebrew's way of saying Adam was given a consciousness, he was given a mind, then yes, a fetus in the womb has Nishmat Chaim. It has some kind of consciousness. It has some kind of mind. Obviously, that has to develop later on following birth and growing up. But a fetus is a person. So this is something very, very serious, and it's something which is not going away in theological diatribe. All right, so that concludes our theology roundup. Let's get into some news. And of course, the main issue which is dominating the news right now is the summit in Washington yesterday. President Trump, President Zelensky, and all the different European leaders. Now, we do our news analysis after the theology review, because in the news roundup, everything is time sensitive. Everything changes day to day. And we know that just with what took place yesterday and some of the intention to, look, within the next 2 weeks, we want to see Zelensky and Putin at a summit. We know that can definitely change. We pray for peace in Israel. We pray for peace in Ukraine, but we know the situation on the ground can change. So all the news stories we're about to go through, you can look at them yourself when this episode is archived later today on MessianicApologetics.net. And before we get started, the following articles and social media posts are employed in good faith via the principle of fair use, which allows copyrighted material to be used for the purposes of news reporting, teaching, scholarship, research, and commentary. So let's switch our screens back. Okay, excellent. Okay, so here's a post I encountered yesterday on X from Alan Didio, who is someone whose articles are featured on Charisma Magazine frequently. My Charisma, we've referenced them before. Definitely a pre-tribulationist, but here he talks about how many believe that the fall feasts of God reveal his prophetic calendar. Okay, I don't know a Messianic person who doesn't agree with that. Doesn't disagree, I'm sorry. Rosh Hashanah equaling the rapture, Day of Atonement equaling the tribulation, Tabernacles equaling the millennium. Do you believe God has revealed his end time plan in the fall feast? Almost every Messianic person I know would say yes. Do they agree with this, though? That is something else. Now, this year, because of the ongoing Israel-Gaza conflict, what took place, the 12-day war with Iran, the Russia-Ukraine situation, other situations, things here at home in the United States, people are going into the fall high holidays 2025 with a heightened expectation regarding future events. This year, I have to be honest, retweaking Messianic Insider to involve theology and news, right? People are talking about current events. We better discuss them. And what are we supposed to do about some of these things? But the pre-tribulational approach toward the fall high holidays, Rosh Hashanah being the rapture, Yom Kippur being the tribulation, the millennium being represented by Sukkot or the Feast of Tabernacles, that's not the only approach. Because while there are multidimensional aspects of the appointed times and Yeshua's fulfillment, and I've said for many years, it's actually quite simple to think that, well, Yeshua fulfilled the spring feast in his first coming, and he'll fulfill the fall feast in his second coming. When just off the bat, we know that with themes from Passover, the judgment of God upon Egypt, the figure of the Egyptian Pharaoh, there are definitely parallels to be made between Passover and what's seen in the book of Revelation. So this idea that, well, Passover's now been fulfilled, and to argue that it doesn't teach you anything about the future end times and 70th week of Daniel, that doesn't hold up. Likewise, there are things in the fall festivals, particularly Yeshua's sacrifice, not only fulfilling the sacrificial requirements of Passover and unleavened bread, but also Yom Kippur. It's talked about in Hebrews. That indicates that, you can't just, have this really tightly packaged way of looking at prophetic fulfillment. Having the computer mindset of zeros and ones in terms of prophetic fulfillment, that is something very, very Western. It's not something that you see in the Holy Scriptures. So I would definitely say that for the future, we're going to see some additional components of the spring holidays come into pass. And with the past first coming of Yeshua, there are elements in his ministry and his work which you see fulfilled in the fall high holidays as well. With all that said, how do post-tribulationists in today's Messianic community, especially people who observe the appointed times as a regular part of their spirituality, not just some pre-trib Christians who are separated and, I've been enriched by my Jewish roots, but I don't observe these things as a part of my actual faith practice. How do those of us who actually observe these things as part of our faith practice in the Messianic Jewish community, at a Messianic congregation or synagogue, how do we approach future fulfillment from a post-trib standpoint? Generally speaking, we would look at Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, as representing the blowing of the shofar, our being called up into the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, not necessarily be taken away into heaven, but meet him in the air. Subsequent to that, Yom Kippur would represent a Day of the Lord point event. It would represent things like the final battle of Armageddon, God's specific orge or wrath judgments being poured out upon the unrighteous of planet Earth. And then, yes, entering into Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, that would represent the millennium and the eternal state beyond. But one of the things I don't think we emphasize enough is that in terms of the main core, Yeshua coming as the Passover lamb, being resurrected as the bread of life, later the Holy Spirit being poured out at Shavuot, we commonly ascribe the main prophetic fulfillment of the spring appointed times in the scope of the spring season of Yeshua's death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. Here you see from a pre-trib standpoint, the main core fulfillment of the fall high holidays, that's going to be spread out over the 70th week of Daniel. I would have to say that the main core fulfillment of the fall high holidays in the future, that's going to take place within the scope of the fall high holidays in the final days of the future 70th week of Israel. It's not going to be, well, you're raptured up to heaven, but then we're going to wait 7 years for Armageddon and then entering into the millennium. No, it's going to be, the main fulfillment is going to be within the scope of the actual days in which they occur. But we know, at least from a meme like this, that people are going to be talking about the fall high holidays, all of this, and what's going to happen. And we've got to be ready at our Messianic congregations to see that small group of interested Christians anticipating the rapture. And of course, they're going to be at a Messianic congregation because, well, that's the best place to be when the rapture happens. May even be when they blow the shofar. We've got to be there to offer some alternative opinions. Okay, our next story, reposted from Charlie Kirk, and you can see about a 1-minute video there. President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. We had a fantastic NATO summit together as the two largest and biggest economies in the world. Speaking of the US and the EU, we had the largest trade deal ever agreed, and now we are here to work together with you on a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. Okay, so any of you all who were watching the news yesterday doubtlessly saw how there were comparisons and contrasts made between President Zelensky's previous visit to the Oval Office and the White House versus this visit with President Zelensky and all these other European and NATO leaders. So generally speaking, and of course, this is based on what we've just seen in the past day or so, the meeting had a very different tone. It was very positive. It was like, look, we've got to get some kind of a peace agreement. Russia, Ukraine, we've got to stop this conflict. The question is going to be, what is going to ensue in the coming days? And I think everyone knew they had to be on their best behavior. I think everyone knew that we've got to be able to make some progress with this situation. And whether we like Donald Trump or not, he was the one who met with Vladimir Putin, and he is going to be the one who gets the ball rolling on this. Okay, our next story, changing venues slightly. This is from Vivid yesterday, August the 18th. Hamas demands a deal that does not include the release of all the hostages and includes more absurd conditions. So is there going to be able to be some kind of an agreement made to get the hostages back from Hamas at the very least? I don't know. We know that with the momentum which has been building, Donald Trump putting together all of these peace deals, whether it was India and Pakistan, Thailand and Cambodia, Azerbaijan and Armenia, Now, the one which is an immediate view is Russia and Ukraine. If he's able to do that, he's probably going to be able to get something resolved with Israel and Hamas. We wait and see. We know that this is something which some kind of point event, just politically, not prophetically, some kind of point event politically is coming, because the nations of the world, the countries of the world are growing impatient regarding Israel, Hamas. Okay, some of you all may have seen how I reposted this on my X Twitter feed from Lee W. Brainerd, who is definitely a pre-tribulationist. If Jesus comes this year, I'll be happy. If Jesus comes next year, I'll be happy. If Jesus comes a few years down the road, I'll be happy. If Jesus comes much farther away than we anticipate, exposing the failures of our reckonings, I'll be happy. Agree with him 100% there. But then he says, my hope is in the fact of the rapture before the tribulation, not its timing. Well, obviously he's responding here to all of the false pre-tribulation rapture, soft, we'll call it, date setting. And of course, how did I respond to this? This is how I responded to this. Go to, switch over to my X account really quickly. Okay, I said, my hope is not in some pre-trib escape from this earth to heaven. My hope is in the return of the Messiah to the earth for him to establish true righteous government. And I think that most Messianic people who recognize that God's intention for human beings isn't for them to just fly away to heaven and sit for eternity on some harp, on some cloud playing harp, excuse me. Instead, it is for God's kingdom to come down to the earth and to engulf it in his righteousness. I'm sorry, I just saw that the mic was muted, so we're going to have to do that story again. Okay, from Open Source Intel Defender, it's sounding more and more like we are going to see concrete security guarantees by the US and Europe discussed and possibly announced today. We didn't see that yesterday for Ukraine. The crux of the issue in negotiating peace between Russia and Ukraine is going to be, what is the security guarantee for Ukraine going to be? Ukraine can't join NATO. Is it going to be able to be associated with the NATO countries in kind of a NATO-style relationship? Probably not. But that's really going to be the crux of whether peace is possible or not. How quickly or not so quickly we see it come to pass. From Rapid Response 47, POTUS. If everything works out well today, we'll have a trilat, and I think there will be a reasonable chance of ending the war when we do that. So this is obviously from very short clip. President Zelensky, President Trump meeting in the Oval Office. If there's a summit where Zelensky, Putin, and Trump can be there together, Trump says we're likely to have an agreement. We hope that that is something we can see take place sometime in the coming 10 days to 2 weeks. Also, Rapid Response 47, this is in the later meeting, which was held between President Trump and the different European leaders. Finnish President Alex Stubb I think in the past 2 weeks, we've probably had more progress in ending this war than we have in the past 3.5 years. That's true. And this conflict cannot continue indefinitely. From the New York Post yesterday, August the 18th, during his meeting with President Trump, Ukrainian President Zelensky shared a letter from his wife for First Lady Melania Trump. Zelensky explained that his wife was very moved by Melania's letter to Vladimir Putin and her concern for children. It's not for you, Zelensky joked as he handed it over. Rapid Response 47 yesterday from POTUS. All of us would obviously prefer an immediate ceasefire while we work on a lasting peace. President Zelensky and President Putin can talk a little bit more about that, but I believe a peace agreement at the end of all this is something that's very attainable. Now, if you saw some of the discussions yesterday, there is a slight disagreement or a slight divergence, let's call it, between those who believe that you have to have some kind of ceasefire and then that can lead to a peace agreement, whereas Trump is saying, no, we can go straight to a peace agreement. But again, more has been done on this in the past several weeks than in the past several years. From Benny Johnson, President Trump says a resolution will be reached on almost everything today. Okay, we're still waiting to see some of the details, but many things were taken care of and certainly set in motion at yesterday's meeting. The New York Post yesterday, August the 18th, President Trump posed with other European leaders for a ceremonial family photo in Cross Hall at the White House. The high-level gathering of Zelensky and top European partners is seen as a positive for Trump, who is mediating the talks in hopes of getting both Ukraine and Russia at the same table to negotiate a final agreement. You would not see this kind of a thing happening from the previous administration, whether you like Trump or dislike him. From Open Source Intel Defender yesterday. Today's meeting between U.S. President Donald J. Trump, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and European leaders had now concluded, with President Trump said to have also spoken earlier with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Several of the European leaders are remaining at the White House to continue further negotiations and to discuss potential security guarantees for Ukraine. So this is the kind of thing where people are commenting, all of these world leaders, Zelensky, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, President of France, Chancellor of Germany, Prime Minister of Italy, European Union, NATO, they're all coming to Donald Trump. Okay, I don't doubt the fact that Donald Trump, certainly as someone with a business background, wants a deal made. Yet some people are likely to push this beyond that and say, see, this is exactly how the beast, this is exactly how the Antichrist, the anti-Messiah is going to bring people into his sphere of influence. In principle, I do agree with that. Is it Donald Trump? That remains to be seen. And this is where people need to keep their speculation at a minimum. Also from Open Source Intel Defender, forwarding on a post Donald Trump made on Truth Social, U.S. President Donald J. Trump praised today's meeting at the White House with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and other European leaders in a post minutes ago on Truth Social, stating that security guarantees for Ukraine were discussed, provided by both Europe and the United States. Okay, so this is more of what we've already covered. From Open Source Intel. Following White House discussions with President Zelensky and European leaders, Trump contacted President Putin to arrange a bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky at an undetermined location to be followed by a trilateral meeting, including himself. So you can look at these two posts in greater detail, but that is what we are now waiting on. And I didn't see any significant developments about that before we went live. So we're now waiting on, they want to arrange a bilateral meeting, Putin and Zelensky, and then a trilateral meeting, Putin, Zelensky, and Trump where they can close an apparent deal. That's what they're working toward. But we know that this is something which can definitely change given the circumstances on the ground. Every day, I encourage people, pray for peace in Israel, pray for peace in Ukraine. Because yes, progress was made in Alaska, progress was made yesterday, but things could just fall through. Things could just fall apart. That's the nature of the world in which we're living. We don't want that to happen, but that is, those are possible realities. Okay, from Charlie Kirk, this is an important clip. The trilateral Trump, Putin, and Zelensky meeting will happen within 2 weeks, according to sources close to German Chancellor Merz. Trump is the peace president. Pray for peace. Okay, let's change venues ever so slightly. Forwarded on by Benny Johnson yesterday, August the 18th. Former Attorney General Bill Barr testified under oath today that President Trump is not connected to the Epstein files. And if he were, Biden would have already leaked it. So we do know that even though right now the main news story in view is Russia, Ukraine, we've got issues, Israel, Gaza. There are these other things out there, the Epstein files, Russiagate. A lot of that's probably going to start hitting near the end of the month, into September, and during the fall high holidays. So pray for peace in Israel, pray for peace in Ukraine, pray for calmness and stability here on the American home front. Here's a Fox News clip forwarded on by Rapid Response 47. This was a very successful day, says Secretary General NATO. That's Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister. President Trump is a pragmatic peacemaker. He is putting pressure, but he is also looking for ways to solve this. And indeed, in the previous administration, how much of this was actually being solved? We were just going to send more money to Ukraine. We're just going to send them more weapons. Yeah, but you can't send them money and weapons indefinitely. You're going to have to resolve it sooner or later. So this is very important, and pray for peace. Okay, so we're going to switch gears back to what took place last week. The interview Tucker Carlson had with Mother Agapia Stephanopoulos. Of course, that's got a lot of people, particularly conservative evangelicals who support Israel. It's got them really upset. It's got a lot of people in the Messianic community really ticked off. And everyone is responding to her claims that in Gaza, Hamas is okay. It's the Israelis who persecute Christians. It's the Jews who persecute Christians. So here's a response from Aish Global. These are Orthodox Jews living in Israel. Recently, Tucker Carlson featured a conversation with Mother Agapia where they used an image of the Jewish temple model from the Aish World Center rooftop and shockingly suggested that Jews would blow up the mosque to rebuild the temple. So, are Orthodox Jews in Israel militant enough to bomb the Dome of the Rock so they can rebuild the temple? Well, here in this response, Rabbi Stephen Berg, CEO of Aish, set the record straight. For 2,000 years, Jews have prayed for the temple. It will be rebuilt in the time of the Messiah in peace. In 1967, when Israel regained the Temple Mount, we had the option to destroy the mosque. Instead, we placed it under Muslim control and said, continue to pray. Okay, and this is why when you hear discussion about the Temple Mount faithful, red heifers, they've got all the equipment pretty much ready to go, the vestments of the priests, the different temple accoutrements. Well, why don't they just go up and level the Dome of the Rock and then rebuild the temple? Well, unlike any other conflict which has taken place with Israel and its Arab neighbors, if Israel were to do that, we would have World War III. We would see jihad at a level we have never seen before. Things would probably go nuclear, and yeah, it could lead to the annihilation of the human species if other powers got involved. That's not what we want to see. Instead, from a standard premillennial approach to what should happen with resumption of animal sacrifices, certainly the establishment of some kind of tent or tabernacle like during the reign of King David, in all probability the rebuilding of the temple, it would have to be through peace negotiations, through some kind of a dynamic or charismatic figure, i.e. the beast, who would see the state of Israel, the Temple Mount Faithful, granted the ability to rebuild the temple. We have no idea how that is going to specifically come about. All we can do is speculate. But if some kind of radical Jewish group were to blow up the Dome of the Rock, which Israel could have done in 1967 and did not do, the state of Israel would no longer exist, and we may not be having this conversation either, because this would be a species-ending event. Instead, we look for the Temple Mount Faithful to get some part of the Temple Mount. It's going to be via the guise of, love, peace, and tolerance between the Abrahamic religions, like you see in Dubai, in the UAE, some of those social media posts we've gone through in the past. That's how they're going to be able to rebuild the temple, not some kind of terrorist act. All right, our next story, Rapid Response 47. This is a clip from Fox News. The only leader in the world that can talk to both Putin and Zelensky and bring them both to a meeting is Donald J. Trump, says Secretary Rubio. Right, and it's because of things like this why people are going to start claiming if he's able to pull off a peace agreement with Russia and Ukraine and then follow it with Israel and Gaza, well, maybe Trump is the beast. Okay, that's one scenario people are positing. Or maybe Trump is setting the world up for that period spoken of in Thessalonians, while they're saying peace and safety, peace and security, peace and prosperity, that kind of thing, then sudden destruction comes upon them. What we're not told in that prophecy is how long that period actually is. And we've got to be thinking strategically that, is it just going to be a really short period of time? What if it's an elongated period of time that puts a lot of people to spiritual sleep? Hey, we're just here to put things out there, put possibilities to be noted. The work of God's kingdom, whether it's short or long, doesn't end. All right, here's a news story, Rapid Response 47 from CBS News. This is today, August the 18th. A recent poll found that nearly 70% of Ukrainians now support a negotiated peace deal. That's up from just over 20% at the start of the invasion. Now, if this is accurate, that is huge. And the reason it is huge is because certainly during the Biden years, the idea is that, look, we just got to give Ukraine money and weapons, and they're going to fight as long as they can, possibly even down to the last man. Trump comes on the scene like, no, we can't do that. You got too many Ukrainians, too many Russians dying. This is not good for the world. The killing needs to stop. I totally agree with him on that. And if I had been in the White House, this would never have happened. I also agree with him on that. But the possible poll that 70% of Ukrainians want this war to stop and want a negotiated peace, that is huge, because guess what? Throughout a great deal of this conflict, Russia and Ukraine, a lot of people in the Messianic community have had to be very careful with how they have approached this. Not, is Russia right? Is Ukraine right? Is Russia wrong? Is Ukraine wrong? And the reason we've had to be very careful with how we've approached this, other than, pray for peace in Ukraine, pray for peace, is because the largest Messianic Jewish community is in North America. The second largest Messianic Jewish community is in Ukraine. And likely the third largest Messianic Jewish community is in Russia. So we've had to approach this issue very, very carefully. Pray for peace, pray for the killing to stop. But that's why we haven't been able to easily go into like, well, what were the causes behind this? And, yes, Russia, is a bully. Russia is a big giant bear. But, what are some of the other things which created this? Ukraine wanting to join NATO, wanting to have direct, EU membership, that got Russia all upset. What are some of these things? The biggest casualty in war is always the truth. And so we know, we should be aware that if a peace agreement comes, there are going to be things which come out later regarding, oh, that's why Russia did what Russia did and why Ukraine did what Ukraine did. Okay, so speaking of Russia, from Fox News yesterday, August the 18th, the Russian Foreign Ministry roundly rejected the idea of NATO forces serving as peacekeepers in Ukraine, a provision sought by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky and his European allies and U.S. brokered peace talks. Indeed, not saying that, Putin is not somebody to be trusted. He's not somebody to be relied upon. He is a bully. He does have problems, but Trump is his best bet to get some kind of negotiated peace and some kind of an honorable conclusion to this. But we're going to see over the next couple of weeks, as we've seen, well, they want to get a bilateral summit together, Putin and Zelensky, and then later a trilateral summit with Donald Trump. The Russians are going to not always agree to various proposals. And while we hope that this would just delay certain things, yeah, it could just fall through and we could be in a much worse situation. That's a possibility we can't dismiss. From Newsmax yesterday, August the 18th, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, security guarantees will probably be unpacked by our partners and more details will emerge. All of this will somehow be formalized on paper within the next week to 10 days. And indeed, it's going to be in those security guarantees for Ukraine where we see how serious the Russians are to resolving this conflict. Okay, two more stories. Yesterday, you talked about arranging a meeting to take place in 2 weeks between Putin and Zelensky. Is there an update there, and do you plan to attend? So this is what Trump is working toward. There's a 1.5 minute clip here. POTUS, I thought I'd first let them meet. They haven't been exactly best friends. It only matters if we get things done. Okay, and then finally, and this took place yesterday evening at the Oval Office, from Benny Johnson, the single most powerful image of 2025. President Trump at the Resolute desk with world leaders crowding around him, just listening. Nothing else comes close. And you can just see some of those leaders in the picture. You got Prime Minister of Italy, EU Commissioner, Chancellor of Germany, President of France, NATO Secretary General. I don't know where the UK Prime Minister is. He might be sitting in the back there, or he might be off to the side. But that is a very serious image. And yes, that is where a lot of people are claiming that, oh, Trump is bringing all these world leaders to him. Maybe he's the beast. Let's keep our speculation at a minimum. But we also know that history has cycles which repeat themselves. And this is exactly the kind of thing you would expect to see that final world leader do. Bring all these major world leaders into his office, into his chambers, to resolve some kind of seemingly impossible world situation. And as I've stressed, right now we need to pray for peace in Israel. Didn't have that much Israel news today, but I think we're probably going to have some more tomorrow. Pray for peace in Ukraine. We also have things unfolding here on the American home front, which pray for calmness, pray for stability among a lot of us. We've got the fall high holidays hitting. So the prophetic expectation is high, but stay grounded and keep your speculation to a minimum. Because I remember many years ago, 30 years ago, 29 years ago, there was a high degree of end time speculation associated with the coming new millennium, and everyone was wrong. So that's not to say that a basic premillennial scenario is to be tossed away. It's not to say that Yeshua isn't returning, because he certainly is. But it is to say, learn some of the lessons from the past and speculate responsibly. Offer a disclaimer if necessary. Look, this is my opinion based on the information as we have it today. But we don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. And it's actually in those things which we cannot predict, we cannot anticipate, where all of us are going to either have to say, hey, I had to adjust some things, I had to recalibrate some things in my end time opinions and beliefs, or I was wrong and I've got to now eat crow. Don't be the kind of person who has to do that. As always, on behalf of Outreach Israel Ministries and Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support of all of our ministry efforts. I encourage you to check out our ministry website, messianicapologetics.net, where you can find a wide array of free articles, frequently asked questions, entries. You can go into our archives and see old episodes of Messianic Insider, McKee Moment Shorts, etc. We'll see you tomorrow with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you, shalom, and take care.